Imagine you build something so powerful, so dominantly superior to everything around it, that the governing body of your sport doesn't just lose to you, they ban you. Not because you cheated, not because you broke any rule, but simply because you were too good. That is the story of the Chrysler 426 Hemi engine. A mechanical monster so ruthlessly efficient, so grotesquely overpowered compared to everything else on the track, that in 1965, the National Hot Rod Association, the NHRA, looked at the competition and said, "No, this engine cannot race." And just like that, one of the greatest performance engines ever built in American history was pulled off the track. But here's the thing about legends, you can ban them from the race. You cannot ban them from history. I'm going to tell you the full story today. Where this engine came from, why it was so untouchably fast, what exactly happened when the NHRA swung that hammer, and how this banned piece of engineering went on to become one of the most iconic, most valuable, most celebrated engines ever produced in the golden age of American muscle. Stick with me. This is going to be a good one. To understand why the 426 Hemi was such a jaw-dropping, competition-destroying piece of machinery, you need to understand what came before it, and you need to understand one very specific word. That word is hemispherical. Most engines in the 1950s and early 1960s used what's called a wedge-shaped combustion chamber. This is the space inside the engine where the fuel and air mix and explode to push the piston down. A wedge chamber is simpler to manufacture, cheaper to build, and perfectly adequate for most purposes. But Chrysler's engineers, a brilliant, obsessive group of men who believed that performance was never optional, looked at the wedge chamber and said, "We can do better." Their idea was to use a hemispherical combustion chamber instead. Picture half a sphere, like a dome, carved into the top of the cylinder. Because of its rounded shape, this design allows the spark plug to sit right in the center of the chamber, surrounded equally by the fuel and air mixture on all sides. What does that mean in practice? It means the explosion is more complete, more efficient, more even. Every single drop of fuel burns better. You get more power from the same amount of fuel. You get more heat, more pressure, more force pushing that piston downward. The geometry of the hemisphere is not just aesthetically beautiful, it is mechanically perfect. It is the most efficient shape for combustion. Chrysler's engineers knew this. They pursued it obsessively. Now, Chrysler had actually experimented with hemispherical chamber technology as far back as the early 1950s. The original firepower Hemi engines of 1951 were remarkable for their era, producing more power than almost anything Detroit had seen at the time. These early Hemis powered everything from passenger cars to military vehicles, and they earned a reputation as brutish, uncompromising power plants that simply did not care about being gentle. But by the late 1950s, Chrysler had actually moved away from the Hemi design, switching to the cheaper and simpler wedge chamber engines across most of their lineup. The Hemi, for a brief moment, seemed like it might fade into engineering history. Then came the 1960s. And with them, the American horsepower war. By the early 1960s, the race between American automakers had become almost comically intense. Ford was pouring money into performance. Chevrolet was developing the legendary big block engines. Pontiac was building the GTO. Every major manufacturer understood that speed sold cars, that a win on the racetrack on Sunday meant sales at the dealership on Monday. Chrysler could not afford to sit still. In 1963, the company's engineers began a secret, high-priority project. Build a new engine specifically designed to dominate drag racing. Not a mild-mannered street engine with a performance tune. Not a showroom motor with some extra horsepower. A purpose-built, all-out, take-no-prisoners racing engine that would make Chrysler impossible to ignore. They went back to the hemisphere. They went back to their roots. And they built the 426. The 426 Hemi displaced 426 cubic inches, that's 7.0 liters for our metric friends, making it one of the largest displacement V8 engines of its era. But size alone doesn't make an engine legendary. It's what you do with that size that matters. The engineers fitted it with a massive dual 4-barrel carburetor setup, 2 carburetors feeding an ocean of fuel and air into those perfectly hemispherical chambers. They used high-compression pistons, aggressive camshafts, and a free-flowing exhaust system designed to let the engine breathe as freely as possible. The result? Chrysler officially rated the 426 Hemi at 425 horsepower. But here's a little secret that every gearhead of the era already knew: that official number was a lie. A deliberate, strategic understatement. The real output of the 426 Hemi was widely believed to be closer to 500, possibly even 550 horsepower. Chrysler downrated it to avoid scrutiny, to sidestep insurance complications, and to keep competitors from understanding exactly how deep in the hole they already were. At a time when most muscle cars were celebrating 300 to 360 horsepower, the Hemi was operating in a different dimension entirely. The engine was so large, so physically imposing, so brutally substantial in person, that the mechanics and engineers who worked with it gave it a nickname immediately. They called it the elephant engine. Because it was big. Because it was heavy. Because it was loud. And because just like an elephant, once it decided to move, there was absolutely nothing you could do to stop it. The 426 Hemi made its public debut in February 1964 at what might be the most famous race track in American motorsport, Daytona International Speedway, at the Daytona 500. And it did not arrive quietly. Chrysler entered multiple cars powered by the new 426 Hemi, including Plymouths and Dodges prepared by some of the best race teams of the era. The competing teams from Ford and General Motors looked at the Chrysler entries during practice, heard those engines running, and felt something they weren't used to feeling at the racetrack. They felt nervous. The qualifying runs made it official. The Hemi-powered cars were posting lap times that nobody else could touch. The top speed numbers coming out of the Chrysler camp were not just better than the competition, they were embarrassingly, humiliatingly better. Other teams were doing everything they could with their own engines, tuning and tweaking and trying every trick in the book, and they still couldn't close the gap. Then the race started. Richard Petty, who would go on to become the greatest NASCAR driver in history, the king himself, drove a Plymouth Belvedere powered by the 426 Hemi. He led the race with an authority that felt almost casual. When he pressed the throttle, the car simply went away from the field. There was no drama, no nail-biting finish, no question of whether the Hemi was fast enough. It was over before it began. Petty won the 1964 Daytona 500. But more than that, Hemi-powered cars finished first, second, and third. The top three positions on the podium were all Chrysler. All Hemi. All elephant engine. The competition didn't just lose. They were lapped by history. The motorsport world took notice immediately. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't one good day or one lucky setup. This was systemic, structural, total domination by an engine that was simply operating at a level the competition hadn't reached and couldn't quickly replicate. After Daytona, Hemi-powered Chrysler cars went on to win race after race throughout the 1964 season. They were virtually unbeatable in a straight line. On oval tracks, on drag strips, on any surface where raw power and torque translated directly into speed, the 426 Hemi made everything else look like it was standing still. The drag racing community noticed even more than NASCAR. Because in drag racing, there are no corners, no strategies, no fuel conservation games. It is pure, brutal, honest acceleration. The fastest car wins. Period. And with the Hemi, Chrysler had the fastest car. By a country mile. In the NHRA, the National Hot Rod Association, which governed professional drag racing in America, the Hemi-powered Mopars began making records look like suggestions. Times that had stood for years were being obliterated. Quarter-mile runs that were supposed to be the ceiling of what was physically possible were being broken by Hemi-powered cars running with a kind of lazy, effortless speed that terrified the competition. Other manufacturers started making noise. Ford complained. General Motors engineers privately admitted they had no immediate answer to the Hemi. The racing world was watching one engine make an entire sport look unfair. And the NHRA was watching too. They were taking notes. And they were building a case. The question was no longer whether the Hemi was fast. That had been settled emphatically. The question that was beginning to simmer in the boardrooms and back offices of American motorsport was darker and more complicated. Is it too fast? Is one engine so superior that it's actually ruining the competition? And if so, what do you do about it? January 1965. The NHRA held its annual rules announcement, the moment each year when the organization sets out the technical regulations that will govern the coming racing season. Teams plan their entire year around these rules. Manufacturers invest millions of dollars in engine and car development based on what is and isn't allowed. This particular announcement dropped like a bomb. The NHRA announced that for the 1965 season, the 426 Hemi engine would not be eligible to compete in the organization's sanctioned drag racing events. Not in its current form. Not as currently configured. The engine that had dominated 1964 so completely that it made the entire field look ordinary was out. The official reasoning given by the NHRA was technical in nature. The organization stated that the 426 Hemi was not a production engine, meaning it was not available for purchase by regular consumers in a standard street car. Under NHRA rules, engines had to meet certain production volume thresholds to be eligible for various racing classes. The argument was that the Hemi was essentially a pure race engine being used in what were supposed to be production car classes, giving Chrysler an unfair advantage over manufacturers who were using engines that regular people could actually go buy at a dealership. There was logic to this argument. The 426 Hemi in its 1964 racing form was indeed a purpose-built race engine, hand-assembled, carefully blueprint, not available in any showroom. The NHRA was, in theory, simply enforcing rules that existed to keep the playing field level. But in practice, everybody knew what this was. This was the NHRA looking at a racing landscape where one engine had made competition almost meaningless, and doing what any governing body does when one team or manufacturer becomes so dominant that the sport itself suffers. They changed the rules. The NHRA didn't ban the Hemi because it was illegal. They banned it because it was unbeatable, and an unbeatable car is bad for racing, bad for sponsorship, bad for the sport. NASCAR, meanwhile, took a slightly different approach but ended up in a similar place. After watching Chrysler dominate the 1964 season with Hemi-powered cars, NASCAR also moved to restrict or effectively exclude the engine for 1965 through a combination of rule changes that made it impractical to run in the major series. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Because Chrysler did not respond to this ban the way most manufacturers respond when a sanctioning body slaps them down. They did not quietly accept the decision. They did not make a polite public statement expressing disappointment while privately getting to work on a compliant engine. They did not write a letter to the editor of Motor Trend magazine and then move on with their lives. Chrysler Corporation declared war. The company's official response to the NHRA ban was breathtaking in its boldness. Chrysler announced that it was withdrawing all factory support and participation from NHRA-sanctioned events for the entire 1965 season. Not just some events. All of them. Chrysler would not show up. Their factory teams would not compete. Their sponsorship money would not flow. Their engineers and mechanics would not be there. This was a statement of pure defiance. Chrysler was essentially telling the NHRA, you can take our engine out of your rulebook, but you cannot make us play in your sandbox. And if we're not playing in your sandbox, we're going to go build our own sandbox and have a better time in it. And that's exactly what they did. Instead of competing in NHRA events throughout 1965, Chrysler redirected their racing resources toward unsanctioned drag racing events, private match races, independent strips, outlaw events that operated outside the NHRA's jurisdiction. These events had no rulebook requiring production-based engines. They just wanted the fastest cars, and Chrysler had the fastest cars. The Hemi-powered cars kept running. They kept winning. They kept breaking records. They were just doing it in a different arena. Meanwhile, the NHRA found itself in an awkward position. A significant portion of the drag racing community, fans, racers, track operators, were furious about the ban. The Hemi-powered cars were the crowd favorites. They were the ones people came to watch. They were the ones that generated the noise and the excitement and the jaw-dropping performances that made drag racing worth attending. Without Chrysler, without the Hemi, without the elephant engine shaking the grandstands and melting the asphalt, the NHRA's events were quieter. Literally and figuratively. Attendance at several NHRA events in 1965 dropped noticeably. The organization had made a technically defensible decision on paper, and it cost them in the one currency that matters most in motorsport: excitement. Chrysler, for their part, used the exile productively. Their engineers spent 1965 doing exactly what the NHRA had complained they hadn't done. They developed a street version of the 426 Hemi. A version that could be ordered from a dealership. A version that regular customers, wealthy, enthusiastic, brave regular customers, could actually buy and drive on public roads. This was the move that would change everything. For the 1966 model year, Chrysler introduced what would become one of the most significant options packages in the history of the American automobile, the Street Hemi. This was the 426 Hemi engine, adapted and certified for road use. It was detuned slightly from the pure racing version. The compression ratio was brought down a touch, the carburetor setup was modified for everyday drivability, and the whole thing was configured to meet the emissions and safety standards of the era. The result was officially rated at 425 horsepower, though as with the racing version, real-world enthusiasts broadly understood that the true output was substantially higher. You could order this engine in a 1966 Dodge Charger. You could order it in a Plymouth Satellite. You could order it in a Plymouth Belvedere. You walked into a Chrysler dealership, you pointed at the option sheet, you signed on the line, and they handed you the keys to a car with the elephant engine under the hood. There were some important caveats. The street Hemi was extraordinarily expensive as an option. It added a significant premium to the price of the car, roughly equivalent to over $1,000 on top of an already substantial base price, which in 1966 money was a serious amount of cash. It was also thirsty, demanding high-octane premium fuel and delivering fuel economy numbers that would make a modern environmental regulator physically unwell. And it was not exactly subtle to drive. The street Hemi had all the manners and refinement of the race engine it was derived from, which is to say, none. It idled roughly. It demanded to be driven with intention. It was not a car for commuting or errands. It was a car for going fast, for making noise, for feeling the ground shake beneath you when you pressed the throttle and the elephant engine woke up. Now that the engine was available to the public in production vehicles meeting minimum production thresholds, Chrysler went back to the NHRA and presented their case. The street Hemi was real. It was in dealerships. Regular people were buying it. The objection that had led to the 1965 ban, that the engine wasn't a production unit, no longer applied. The NHRA reviewed the situation, and in 1966, they reinstated the 426 Hemi to eligibility in their sanctioned events, with appropriate class rules governing how it could be used. Chrysler came back. The elephant engine came back. And it came back exactly the way you'd expect it to, by immediately winning. Hemi-powered Mopars resumed their dominance in drag racing. In NASCAR, after rule adjustments and negotiations, Hemi-powered cars continued to compete and win. Richard Petty continued his extraordinary career in Hemi-powered Plymouths. The engine that had been banned for being too powerful was back, and it was behaving exactly as badly, which is to say, exactly as magnificently, as it had before. The years 1966 through 1971 represented the golden age of the street Hemi. These were the years when you could walk into a dealership and make a decision that would be considered either brilliant or insane depending on your perspective, to buy one of the most explosively powerful production cars ever built at that point in American history. The cars that received the Hemi option during these years are now considered among the most valuable American muscle cars ever produced. The Plymouth Road Runner Hemi. The Dodge Charger R/T Hemi. The Plymouth Cuda Hemi. These are not just cars, they are rolling pieces of American cultural history, artifacts of an era when the entire nation seemed to agree, at least briefly, that making things faster and louder was inherently good. And then, almost as quickly as the golden age had arrived, it ended. 1971 would be the final year of the street Hemi in production vehicles. The era of unlimited muscle was colliding head-on with a new reality, rising insurance rates that made high-horsepower cars nearly unaffordable to insure for young buyers, incoming emissions regulations that were fundamentally incompatible with the Hemi's architecture, and on the horizon, the oil crisis. The 1971 Plymouth Cuda Hemi and the 1971 Dodge Challenger Hemi are the last of their kind. They are the final expressions of the elephant engine in its street form, and they are the rarest and most valuable of all the Hemi muscle cars. A 1971 Cuda Hemi in original condition has sold at auction for over $3.5 million. Not because it's a perfect car. Not because it's the most advanced or sophisticated automobile ever built, but because it represents the last gasp of something America has never quite been able to recapture, that era of pure, consequence-free, glorious automotive excess. To understand why the 426 Hemi destroyed the competition, you need one word: hemispherical. In a normal wedge chamber engine, the spark plug sits off to the side and the flame travels unevenly across the cylinder. In a hemispherical chamber, the plug sits dead center at the top of the dome. The flame expands outward in every direction equally. A perfect, complete burn every single time. No wasted fuel. No unburned pockets. Pure, efficient explosion. Add 426 cubic inches of displacement, massive dual 4-barrel carbs, and a valve train designed to let the engine breathe completely freely, and you get a machine that was powerful at low revs, mid revs, and high revs simultaneously. No dead zones. No weaknesses. Just wall-to-wall, unstoppable torque that made a 10-second drag race feel like a formality. Ford and Chevrolet had big block engines too. Good ones. But you cannot redesign a combustion chamber overnight. The tooling, the testing, the development, it takes years. By the time anyone could realistically answer the Hemi, the era was already over. And then it became a legend. The 1965 ban, humiliating in the moment, turned out to be the greatest thing that ever happened to the Hemi story. Chrysler didn't beg for re-entry. They spent the exile year building the street Hemi, a road-legal version any buyer could order at a dealership. They turned punishment into evolution. When they came back in 1966, they came back legitimate. And they kept winning. Today, a 1971 Plymouth Cuda Hemi sells for over $3.5 million. Not because it's the most sophisticated machine ever built, but because it represents the last, loudest gasp of an era that America has never quite recovered from. Pure ambition, zero apology. The Hemi was banned for being too powerful. That ban made it immortal.